coming. Thank you for coming back for the continuation of our course. We're exploring the early Christian response to disease and epidemics. We began 2 weeks ago in the 2nd and in the 3rd century, reading the letters of Cyprian of Carthage and Dionysius of Alexandria. Historians recognize that the Christians of the 2nd and the 3rd century responded differently to the pandemics of that period, smallpox and measles. And now for the last 2 weeks, we have gone on a search looking for the reason for the differential response. Last week, we looked at the Epistle of James and at a breakthrough moment in the letter of Paul to the Corinthians. But today, we're going to trace the origin of the Christian difference back to Jesus himself. Pastor Charlie, when I went to Yale Divinity School, more years ago now than I care to admit, the section of our syllabus in New Testament interpretation devoted to the healing ministry of Jesus was rather small and undeveloped. And that's because our courses were still being taught according to an Enlightenment paradigm, rationalistic, and scholars were not very comfortable with healing miracles. Not quite sure if they believed that those things happened. Now, a change occurred in the 1980s when students from around the world, students from countries that we used to refer to as third world countries, began entering the universities, colleges, and seminaries in the United States. And I'll never forget, Pastor Charlie, a poignant moment. I was teaching at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, having just finished my degree. We were reading and translating a text from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, a text that our class will explore in greater detail in a few minutes. And a woman from Kenya raised her hand and said to me, "Professor Welborn, do you believe that this healing miracle really happened?" Well, I was caught off guard. I'd never been asked that point blank. And so for a few minutes, I was silent. And the lovely woman from Kenya continued. She said, "The reason I ask this question is because I have seen things like this in my village back in Kenya." Well, in the middle of the 1980s, there was a great sea change in the study of the Gospels, focused on the healing activity of Jesus. Gerd Tyson at the University of Heidelberg and Howard Clark Key at Boston University published books on medicine, healing, miracle stories, in which they took seriously for the first time that it would appear from the tradition that is found in the earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus devoted the majority of his time and energy to healing the sick. And now it's widely accepted among New Testament scholars that if there is anything that we can say for sure that we know about the historical Jesus, is that he was a healer. When I teach undergraduates at Fordham University the introductory course to the New Testament, and as I search for a way of describing what happened at the beginning of the Jesus movement, I find myself describing what happened with the language of awakening. And the awakening started, I would argue, with Jesus himself. He worked as a carpenter to support his mother and a bunch of younger siblings until, according to Luke, he was 30-something. And then he walked away from the carpenter's bench. And as we will now learn, on the very first day after Jesus returns from the Jordan River and from the wilderness where he was tested by the devil, on the very first day of his public activity on behalf of God's kingdom, he begins to devote himself to healing the sick. So it is with Jesus that it starts. The very beginning of Mark's gospel, after Jesus has called his disciples, he teaches on the Sabbath in a synagogue in Capernaum, a little village in the southern part of Galilee. He teaches on the Sabbath. And then according to Mark chapter 1, beginning in verse 29, and I'm going to be using my own translation, so it may differ a little bit from the text that you're looking at. And immediately, going out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. And the mother-in-law of Simon was lying down, burning with a fever. The Greek word that's translated burning with a fever is the verb puresso. And you hear at the root of that word the noun pour, which is the Greek word for fire. And this verb, puresso, is already found in the medical writings of the great Dr. Hippocrates as a description of the worst kind of fever, burning with a fever. And immediately they, that is Simon and Andrew, spoke to him about her. And going to her, he raised her up, taking hold of her hand. Now, the Greek verb that is translated taking hold is the verb krateo. And if we were all together in our room here at Epiphany, I would ask you to say that with me, krateo. The verb very clearly is used to describe establishing contact, physical contact. And it even implies the use of some force. You can still hear that idea of force in our words, like autocracy, krateo. And now this is important. From the very beginning, Jesus heals by making contact, by making physical contact. And we will see that that is a consistent emphasis in the Gospel of Mark. And the fever, and now the noun, puretos, is used, which means a burning heat, a fiery heat. The noun is already used by the great Dr. Galen. And the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Now, this little formula, the fever left her or departed from her, suggests that the fever is conceived by the author of Mark's gospel and by his readers more broadly. The fever is conceived as an entity that can enter a human body, that can leave a human body, like an unclean spirit. And we will soon learn that there is not much distinction in the time of Jesus between what we would call a disease and a demon or spirit possession. It's possible, I think, to understand this because without any knowledge of viruses were completely unknown to ancient doctors. Disease, therefore, was mysterious. It was daimonic. It had a supernatural force to it. And I think if we were honest, we would have to admit that part of our anxiety today as we live through the COVID-19 pandemic is that there is a mysterious dimension to the disease. You can hear that expressed when doctors refer to the pandemic that we are now experiencing as being caused by the novel coronavirus, a coronavirus that we've not seen before, that with which we've not had contact. There is something mysterious about it. Now, before we leave this first healing of Jesus, I just want to emphasize the importance of touch. In the text of Mark's gospel, no healing word is spoken in this story. Jesus simply takes hold of the hand of Peter's mother-in-law. And as we will soon see, Jesus consistently heals by contact, by touch. In fact, we're going to see in a few minutes that as the news about Jesus as a healer spread, people understood that his way of healing was by touch, by contact. And so people who approach Jesus later in the story asking to be healed, they say to him, "Put your hand upon us," or "touch us." Well, let me stop just at that point for a minute and invite you to think with me about contact, about touch. Now that we know more about how viruses are spread, we are very wisely avoiding contact. I brought my mask with me to the church today, even though Pastor Charlie and I are the only ones in the building. I brought my gloves, not knowing exactly what contact I might have. But there are broader aspects of touch and contact that in which we can still be involved. Pastor Charlie, one of your colleagues in the ministry here in the Dayton area, suggested to me a couple of weeks ago that a way of continuing the healing ministry of Jesus through contact would be to send letters, send messages to the essential workers on the front line, the healthcare workers, the nurses, the ambulance drivers. And this pastor told me that she is including in her letters of contact little checks in modest but significant ways that express appreciation and gratitude. So I hope that in the coming days, we can all think creatively about contact and touch. What are the broader ways in which that aspect of Jesus' ministry can be continued today? Now look at the next story. Chapter 1, beginning in verse 32. When evening had come, when the sun had already set. So it is no longer the Sabbath now. The Sabbath day in the Jewish calendar ends at sunset. So when the sun had already set, they, as the people of Capernaum, brought to him all of those who were sick. The Greek says literally, kakos ekontes, which means were badly off, who were doing poorly. And look how the text continues, those who were possessed by spirits. And the whole city was gathered together at the door, and he healed. Now, before you get the idea that this is something completely supernatural, let me point out that the Greek verb that is used here is the verb therapeuo. We still have that word in our language. It is what?
Therapy.
Therapy, exactly. He provided therapy. And many who were sick with various kinds of diseases, he cast out the spirits, and he would not permit the demonic spirits to speak because they knew him. And some manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark at this point add, because they knew that he was the Messiah. Now, the fact that the people of Capernaum have waited until the sun had gone down to bring the sick to Jesus, of course, implies that they were observing the Sabbath, which is the proper thing to do. But there is a second implication here. Remember that in the preceding story, Jesus healed by contact the mother of Simon Peter during the day before the sun had gone down. In other words, the clear implication is that Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And we're going to find much evidence for this later on. I believe that the inference is already crucial. Compassion was evidently more important to Jesus than purity. He violated the Sabbath law by healing the mother of Simon Peter. Compassion was more important than purity. I want to invite you to think about the implications of that for today. A few weeks ago, when churches began to worship remotely, when the doors to the sanctuaries were closed, some pastors got all upset and protested. And they said, well, it is our tradition. It's a part of our religion that we assemble every Sunday and that we worship together. And Pastor Charlie, one local Dayton pastor with whom I'm in conversation wrestled deeply with the decision and decided that the more compassionate response in the face of the pandemic was to suspend face-to-face worship for a few weeks and to preserve a safe physical distance. Well, let me pause at this point for a few minutes. We've already drawn several lessons out of the text. The importance of contact, the principle that compassion is more important than purity, evidently, for Jesus. Let me pause now and see if there are comments, questions.
If you would like to make a comment, you need to unmute yourself. I can make you be quiet, but you can speak up.
I see Sharon.
Hi. So last week, or well, in the previous, maybe not just last week, but the other sessions, you've mentioned that a pagan response to illness was to kind of cast the person out of the family.
Yes.
And then, so you've been contrasting it with the Christian response. I'm kind of wondering, what was the response during pandemics among communities that were monotheistic before Christians? Could be the Jewish tradition or other traditions that were monotheistic.
Yes, that's a very good question. Of course, we are limited by the surviving sources, so our evidence is partial. But let's take the case of leprosy. In a few minutes, we're going to look in the Gospel of Mark at the account of the healing of a leper by Jesus. And according to rabbinic law in the time of Jesus, lepers were prevented from entering into the community. They had to maintain a distance. They had to quarantine themselves. And if a person recovered from leprosy, which almost never happened, but if it happened, the person, according to Jewish law, had to go and present themselves to the priest so that the priest could declare that they were no longer leprous or contagious. Of course, leprosy is one of the most highly contagious diseases. So are we looking here at something different, something distinctive, maybe even something new? In the case of Jesus, the fact that he does not avoid contact with people that he knows are ill. The mother of Simon Peter, as we've already discovered, was burning with a fever. I think this is still a challenge, for us today. I'll never forget the first time when I had physical contact with a person in Chicago who was dying of AIDS, and how anxious I was when I reached out to embrace that person. So your question is a very good one. It does not appear to be the case that monotheism was the source of the new attitude that we see in the case of Jesus. Lepers in Israel were forced to maintain a quarantine. Thank you, a very good question. Yes, Joan.
You say that it appears that contact is needed, but doesn't a woman get healed just by touching Jesus's cloak, which is a form of contact, but it's not, the laying on of hands.
You're absolutely right, Joan. What is so interesting about that story, we won't have time to look at that wonderful story today from the Gospel of Mark chapter 5, but please read it for yourself. Jesus is moving through a village. He is surrounded on every side by a crowd of people. And a woman who has suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years sneaks up behind Jesus in the crowd and touches him, reaches out and touches him. Now, what's so interesting, Joan, about that story is that evidently it was not credited to Jesus that he initiated the contact. In that story, the woman initiates the contact. And when Jesus discovers that power has gone out of him, he turns around in the crowd, he searches the crowd, looks at the face of people around him, and he asks, "Who touched me?" And the woman at that point steps forward and acknowledges that she is the one who made contact. And look at what Jesus says. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." So you're quite right, Joan. Contact is the common feature of the healing of Jesus. But in some cases, the contact is initiated by other people who are drawn to this person, of whom the reputation is spreading that he heals by contact. It's an interesting question. Yes, John.
Larry, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, well, if John, maybe I'll take John's place here for a moment. I'm not sure what you think about Marcus Borg, but I believe that he has a chapter in one of his books that speaks of a verse. Is it from the Old Testament? "You shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." One of the Gospels translates perfect, which is purity. The other one translates it, "You shall be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful." And that seems for him to set up this idea that we have to be willing, or at least Jesus stepped over the idea of the restrictions of purity. For example, in his story of the Good Samaritan, and the priest is very, very careful not to touch,
Right.
not to stop, not to touch possibly a dead body. And I think we all have a bit of reversion perhaps to that. But then the implication is no, merciful is, and compassion are the new mode of behavior that supersede, and maybe that is the key to unlocking the healing.
Yes, Larry, I think you're absolutely right. That's a wonderful observation. And what we are encountering here in the text is that the principle that compassion outweighs purity as a norm of a faithful life, a life in response to the will of God. It looks to me as if that breakthrough goes back to Jesus himself.
Mm-hmm.
John, did you unmute yourself?
I think I got it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My response was that Simon's mother-in-law, when Jesus took her hand, she had the faith to accept it and to believe that what he was doing was going to help, apparently. And maybe in many cases, it's the people's faith and response to Jesus' activity that's just like the woman touching her gown, or
Yes,
his robe.
you're absolutely right. The Gospel of Mark portrays the interaction, the dynamic between Jesus, the healer, the compassionate, the merciful, the one who touches. The Gospel of Mark portrays that dynamic in relationship to the crowds of people who are drawn to him. And the New Testament scholar who has investigated this dynamic, I believe most insightfully, is a Canadian scholar named John Miller. Before he became a New Testament scholar, he was a psychologist. And for many years, he was the chair of the Historical Jesus Seminar at the Society of Biblical Literature. He has a wonderful little book that I would recommend to everybody here called Jesus at 30. Jesus at 30, published by HarperCollins in San Francisco. And he ponders what was the magnetic force that attracted crowds of people to Jesus. Why did they come to believe that he could heal them, or he could set them free from spirits that were possessing them? John, we're going to talk more about that next week when we explore the psychological dimension of Jesus's healing work. But I just want to note the importance of your observation right now that just as Joan Durham pointed out, the point of contact is sometimes initiated by Jesus, and it is sometimes initiated by the crowds that are drawn to him.
So we see in hospitals today, people have to be given the will to try to recover. And those who don't have the will to recover often don't.
Right. Now, in the interest of time, which is racing away, let me move to the next story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 40. And a leper came to him, appealing to him, falling on his knees before him, and saying to him, "If you will, you are able to make me clean." And now I'm going to translate the Greek text literally. And Jesus felt a wrenching in his guts. The Greek verb is splanknizomai. The splanchna are the bowels, the entrails. Notice the emotional and physical response by Jesus. He felt a wrenching in his guts, and stretching out his hand, he touched him and said to him, "I do will it. I do want it. Be made clean." And immediately the leprosy departed from him. And now my translation is going to differ greatly from the one that you're looking at. I would translate the next phrase, "and being deeply moved by him, immediately he sent him away." The Greek verb that is at issue here is the verb imbriaomai. Imbriaomai, and it describes a boiling up within a person. If you look it up in the Greek dictionary, you'll see that the verb has two meanings. It can mean to warn someone sternly. So if you see something or experience something that is very disturbing, there boils up within you a wave of emotion, and you warn the person sternly. But there is a second meaning for that Greek verb. It can be translated to be deeply moved. So the boiling up can lead to compassion, to empathy. So I disagree with the translators at this point. In fact, I say shame on the translators. I don't think Jesus warned this man sternly. I think he was deeply moved by his condition. And Jesus said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as proof to them." But when he, that is the former leper, had gone away, he began to proclaim energetically and to spread the word widely, so that Jesus was no longer able to enter into a city openly, but he remained outside in unpopulated places, and people were coming to him from everywhere. Now, I have several points to make about this fascinating text before we open it up for discussion. First of all, the disease from which this man is suffering. The Greek word is lepra. And this word is used to describe what is today identified more precisely as Hansen's bacillus. So what we would call leprosy. But the Greek word is also used of a wide variety of other skin diseases, such as psoriasis and lupus. So the word has a very broad usage. Ancient medical writings recognize how contagious leprosy was. And I want to share with you that a few years ago, a new gospel, a papyrus gospel, was discovered in Egypt. You can look at it if you go to the British Museum in London. It's called Papyrus Egerton #2. It's named after the wealthy British man who funded the expedition that discovered the papyrus. In Papyrus Egerton 2, there is an slightly alternative version of this story. The text reads, in Papyrus Egerton 2, the leper speaks a little bit more. He explains to Jesus, "And look, Jesus, teacher, while I was traveling with others who had leprosy, and I was eating with them, at the inn, I contracted leprosy myself." That's a very interesting little addition to the story, isn't it? We might ask ourselves, why was this man traveling with lepers? Is it because one of those lepers was his kinsperson, his brother, his father, his mother? Or was it a friend for whom he was caring? It's a very interesting little story, isn't it? He tells Jesus, while I was traveling with others who had leprosy and was eating at an inn with them, I contracted leprosy myself. If it is permitted, to combine the text of Mark with Papyrus Egerton #2? Do you think it is possible that the reason that Jesus responds with such powerful emotions to the leper, the reason that he feels a wrenching in his guts, and that he is so deeply moved by a boiling up of compassion, is it because he knew that this person had contracted leprosy by caring for lepers, by traveling with them? Well, let me emphasize the importance of Jesus's emotional involvement in the healing. That is clearly expressed in the Gospel of Mark. He feels a tugging in his guts. He is deeply moved. And so he makes contact. He takes hold. The Greek verb is hapto, which doesn't just describe touching. Hapto means to cling to the person. So he took hold of the person and held on to him. Let me invite you to think with me about this. Let me invite your response, and I'll tell you what triggered this for me. When I awoke this morning and turned on National Public Radio, I heard a very poignant story. 27 healthcare officials have been fired or have been forced to resign in 13 states spread all across the United States, including our own who? Amy Acton. That's right, she was forced out. Maybe we don't have enough compassion. Maybe the reason that the coronavirus is still spreading more rapidly in the United States and in Brazil, whose president Bolso described the coronavirus as just a little flu. Maybe there is a deficit of emotional involvement. And I think in this case, it's clear that the emotional involvement of Jesus in the healing is a key factor. And I think it ought to be for us today. Well, let me pause at this point and ask for your comments and questions.
I saw that, or I heard that same story that you're talking about, and the other surprising statistic that Emily Brown mentioned, the woman that they interviewed,
Yes.
she was a public health official that was forced out. She said that 80% of the public health officials on a joint phone call that she was engaged in had said that they'd had threats to their personal safety. Yes. I found that just astonishing. Like, why? And for what? You know, from what I see, it's just so deeply important to the United States to move the economy forward and continue to keep it churning no matter what the cost is. And that line of thinking, there are people that are in the high-risk groups that are even supporting that very notion that I'm willing to sacrifice myself for the American economy. And I just don't understand that. I just, human life or the economy, I would choose the human life, but I don't know. What do I know?
Yeah, we're going to see next week when we look at Mark chapter 5 and Jesus' healing of the Gerasene demoniac, that we're going to look very closely at how Jesus' concern for the welfare of a single possessed and disturbed individual was more important to him than the local economy. Sharon, I want to thank you very much for your comment. It's amazing, isn't it, that those healthcare workers received death threats and hate mail. I have to admit that several weeks ago, when the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, was giving his daily briefing on CNN as the coronavirus was raging across New York City, I have to admit that Diane and I occasionally laughed at how emotional Andrew Cuomo became in talking about the effect of the coronavirus, how frequently he let his emotions get the better of him. And yeah, we laughed at that a few times. But now what do we see? The rate of spread is declining where? In New York. In New York. And I have to believe that it makes a difference what we believe and what we feel. Andrew Cuomo was very out front about the Catholic values that were at the bottom of his emotional response to the pandemic.
Larry House is here.
Yes.
Perhaps a Christological question, the two natures of Christ, and we believe that he is truly God, he is truly human, but we tend, I think, to sacrifice a little bit of the truly human. And if we find that Jesus is psychologically moved when he sees someone like the leper, that it would be pity for that leper. And I think we might dismiss that he's worried maybe he himself will be victim of this contagion. And then I think our temptation is to say, like we say, he was tempted in every way as we are, yet without sinning. Well, really, he was God. He couldn't. And I think we almost feel, well, he had a perfect body. He's perfect. So he couldn't possibly be worried about getting anything himself. But then when we think about his sacrifice, like the first line workers, we have to put him in the same category as they and them with Jesus in terms of the great sacrifice and emotional content this must have when somebody stops and an emergency car driver going to pick up someone and they find out, oh, this is possibly a person who has the virus. So I go on.
Thank you very much, Larry. You have identified one of the reasons why I love the Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel. It's because the Gospel of Mark does not attempt to conceal the very human and emotional way in which Jesus is repeatedly struck when he sees the suffering of others. And I can very well imagine that when Jesus is offered a choice, you remember in Mark's gospel, the leper begins by saying, if you want it, if you will it, you can make me clean. And then he feels this wrenching in his guts. And he says, I do will it. I do want it. And so what Mark conveys to us here is the inner struggle, the emotional struggle within Jesus. And I think it directs us, it counsels us to pay attention to those moments when we feel a wrenching in our guts and when we feel deep emotions boiling up inside us. Maybe the God who made us, who shaped our bodies, maybe God has placed within us a physical and emotional messenger that should guide our responses. All right, I would like to look at one more story before time runs out. Pastor Charlie, do we have time for one more? We do? Good. Would you turn with me to Mark chapter 7, verses 32 to 37, the healing of a deaf and dumb man. And they brought to him a man who was kophos, which means deaf, and mogilalos, which means dumb. In other words, he has a speech impediment. And they appealed to him, look at what it says next, to place his hand upon him. By this time, people know that it is by contact that he heals. And taking him apart from the crowd, privately, he put his fingers in his ears, and having spit, he touched his tongue. And looking up into heaven, he sighed deeply. The Greek verb is stenatzo. Can you say that with me? Stenatzo. It's more than a sigh. It's closer to a groan. Stenatzo. And he said to him, Ephatha, which is not a Greek word, it's an Aramaic word. And so the author of the gospel has to translate it for his Greek readers, which means be opened. And his ears were opened, and the bond of his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak correctly. And he, that is Jesus, ordered them, the people, not to speak to anyone about it. But the more he ordered them, so much more did they proclaim what he had done. And they were all amazed, saying, he has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Now, I want to begin by observing that Matthew has deleted, he has omitted this story. He knows about it. We can be sure of that because he reduces it to one verse. And in Matthew's edited version, he removes all of the touching. Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears. He spit and touched his tongue. Matthew removes all of that. Why? Because the portrayal of Jesus as a person who manipulated the bodies of the sick, who spit and touched and put his finger in the ear, this portrait locates Jesus in proximity to a shaman, to a local popular faith healer. It brings Jesus into proximity with a dangerous group, a marginal social type, the faith healer, the magician, the person who participates in folk religion. And that's what Matthew wants to get rid of. He's not comfortable with the healing process, the manipulation. You see, Jesus does so much more than simply placing his hand for a few seconds upon this man. First, Jesus takes the man apart from the crowd and he heals the man in private. Why is that? Evidently, Jesus did not seek publicity for his work of healing. He doesn't seek acclaim for what he does. Then he puts his fingers in the man's ears and he applies his own saliva to the man's tongue. Now, all of this may sound very strange to us, but if you read ancient medical writings, for example, Pliny the Elder, who wrote the most important natural history in 20 volumes, Pliny the Elder repeatedly talks about the medicinal power, the healing power of saliva. He mentions it 10 times in his natural history. Galen, the great doctor who lectured spellbinding lectures, a kind of Carl Sagan of the ancient world in Rome, Galen emphasizes the healing power of saliva, particularly if the saliva is combined with chewed wheat. Galen argues that this is a good cure for psoriasis. Suetonius, the historian, in his Life of Vespasian, describes a lame man who asked Vespasian to spit upon his leg. And after consulting with his political advisors, the Emperor Vespasian decided it was worth the risk. And so he did it. He spit on the man's leg. Finally, the word Ephatha, the Aramaic word that Mark has to translate as be opened, that word appears in ancient magical text, like the great magical papyrus number 13 in the Papyri Magiki Graike. It appears as a healing word, a spell. Well, let me bring all this together. Mark's portrait of Jesus as a healer who has no trouble behaving like a local shaman, a local folk healer, I think is important for us to think about. Evidently, for Mark, but not for Matthew, Mark was not ashamed of the fact that Jesus crossed social boundaries, that he behaved like a person whose social type was questionable. And as we today think about how we should respond to the pandemic in a broader political and social sense, what should our policy be regarding care for those who are at the margins of society, who don't have health care? What do we risk by becoming their allies? What do we risk politically by advocating for health care for all? Diane and I were in Greece. I was on sabbatical. when the great debate over the Affordable Health Care Bill, sometimes known as Obamacare, when that debate was raging. And we returned to the United States at the end of that summer. We were driving down Far Hills Avenue, and when we reached the intersection of Far Hills and Stroop, there was a large crowd of demonstrators protesting against the Affordable Health Care Plan. As it turns out, they were people from one of the mega churches on the south side of Dayton. As we drew near them, I could see that the protesters against Obamacare were wearing T-shirts. And my eyes are not that good anymore, so it took a few seconds for the words on the T-shirt to come into clear focus for me. I was trying to watch the road too while I was driving. And at first I saw at the top of the T-shirt the words, "I am." And so I was expecting the third line to read, "A Christian." But instead, can you guess what it said? It said, "I am a capitalist." I am a capitalist. A group of church people protesting against the extension of health care to the marginal. And they grounded their protest in the fact that they were good capitalists. Well, that's what we ought to be. That's the social norm. And we see Mark's Jesus challenging that kind of social norm. He risks association with questionable social types. He reaches all the way out and all the way down to the level of the need. And he accommodates himself to the expectations and the needs of the sufferers. Pastor Charlie, you can see once again I've stopped teaching and I've started, well, not just preaching, I've started meddling. And I don't know where we are in terms of time. As you know, I don't carry the watches that graduating students give me every year. Pastor Charlie, where are we in terms of time?
It's a little bit after 10. If you want to take a couple comments before we end, that would be fine.
Thank you. Let me take a couple of comments. Observations, expressions of outrage. John?
Yeah. Seems like greed is the factor both in your Far Hills Stroop attacks against the healthcare people like Amy here in Ohio. Money first, people don't count that important.
That's a good observation. We will come back to that next week. Let me ask you for next week, if you're reading ahead, to focus on Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. That's not the only text that we will look at next week, but next week we're going to explore the psychological dimension of the response of Jesus to disease.
So Dr. Welborn, I wanted to make sure before people sign off that we let them know that there's going to be a change in our schedule starting next week, because we are going to be having our services outside at 9 o'clock, we're moving this session to 11:30 Sunday mornings.
11:30.
11:30. We'll send out a message about that. We'll also make sure that all sessions are being recorded and are available through our website and also through our YouTube page. Thank Aaron Heligowski, who's making sure we get those posted and available for us. And so we appreciate that opportunity. So appreciate your flexibility. We will be on at 11:30 next Sunday in the same format, and we'll go from there.
Thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you, Larry. God bless you all.
Thank you. See you next week.
And